third session of the LSE Growth Commission. I'm Rachel Lomax, and for this particular session I'm going to act as moderator. It's our third session. We had a launch session here, we've had a session on skills, and we've got a load more planned in the future. This session is going to be about statistics. We've called it Beyond GDP, Other Measures of Growth. And we're very lucky that Tony Atkinson, Paul Schreyer and Francesco Caselli, and indeed somebody in Rome, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, are here. Sorry, Francesco, sorry, you're a member of the commission. This shows I'm useless at these things. I ought to say that this session is being recorded, and it's going to be uploaded to our website, which you can find more information about this commission on our website, which is www.lse.act.uk/growth-commission. And I also ought to mention that the Growth Commission is apparently being sponsored by the Higher Education Innovation Fund and the SRC. With all that throat clearing, perhaps we could actually shut the door and get started. And what we're going to do is the three presenters are going to take about 15 minutes each to set out their stall, and then the commissioners are going to ask questions, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from people who've taken the trouble to come and be part of the audience today. I think the order which we might do the presentations is start with Tony Atkinson, we'll go to Paul Schreyer, and then if we can...
Yeah, Jean-Paul Fitoussi is in the
Jean-Paul Fitoussi is behind the wall here, and we'll switch him on. I think he's in Rome somewhere.
We should probably... There's a sort of bit of background noise coming from...
Could you mute it?
Is it possible to...
Jean-Paul, could you mute it? Or is it the central heating?
I am listening.
You're listening, it's very unnerving. We could probably hear rather more of you than we need to. Can you mute it at your end? And then you can switch it on when you want to talk.
Would it be better to start with Jean-Paul, just in case?
No, we're going to start with you.
But if you can speak loudly,
okay.
It would be better for me.
All right, well, it may be that my microphone's not close enough to my mouth, but there we are. Okay, well, let's start with Tony Atkinson, as I suggested. We'll come to you last, if that's all right. Okay.
Okay, my presentation is somewhere here, so I hope that someone knows where it is, because I don't. Very good. Well, thank you for inviting me to take part. I think, in a way, I suspect the three of us are going to say rather similar things, and it might be more exciting to have a sort of clear opponent of the results of the commission, which Joe Stiglitz chaired and Jean-Paul was running together with Amartya Sen. But I think what I'd like to do is move on from there in a way and ask where we are now, and in particular asking the question why in some sense we've made so little progress in the years since then in changing the way we think about judging our performance with regard to economic growth. And I'm doing, I should say, on the basis partly of work I've been doing with my younger colleagues in Oxford who are listed on this slide. The issues I want to discuss are sort of brought out by these two quotations from the recent press. In fact, the top one could be even more recent, since I prepared these slides before last week when the more recent GDP figures came out. And the British economy's performance is yet once again being assessed in terms of one single sole number. That's basically all that appeared in the headlines. It isn't even GDP adjusted for the growth in population. It is simply GDP, which appears in all of the headlines. If we took the trouble even to adjust, as it were, for population growth, we would have been flatlining earlier than now. Ed Balls could have been doing his wonderful hand gestures a couple of quarters ago, because basically 0.7% is very slightly at all above population growth rate. And then the second quotation, I'll leave you perhaps to guess which country this relates to. It's clearly not United Kingdom, since it refers to amazing growth. But I'll leave you to guess which place this might relate to, or I'll tell you at the end of the session. And you can see there it reflects the concerns, which I think are very widespread, including in countries with very high rates of growth, that the lament of ordinary people is not being, that they're not being represented by these measures of performance. And this really brings me to the 2 points I want to make in the 10 plus minutes I have, which are, first of all, that the relationship between GDP and what it means for households is still rather opaque from our current system of national accounts. I should say, to stress, I do think national accounts are probably one of the top social science achievements of at least the last century. So I'm not in any way attacking national accounts. I think they've been an incredible value. But they do, I think, and have perhaps increasingly become rather remote from the experience of individual households. And secondly, the fact that they clearly never set out to address what is always, I think, been an important issue, but has become even more so in the recent decades, that about the distributional implications of growth. So those are the two things on which I'm going to focus. First of all, the human dimension, a human face for the national accounts, which I think the Stiglitz Commission correctly pointed to as one of the things that needs to be done. And in a sense, I think it's almost trying to return national accounts to where they started. I think we, in a way, began, if you look at the first national accounts, which actually not many people know, the United Kingdom was the first country, I think, to produce official national accounts in the 1920s. And you may also not know that those accounts were not published until the 1970s. I don't think anyone from the ONS is going to correct me, but I think that it was only Dick Stone in the 1970s who published a document produced by the Treasury, which the Secretary of the Treasury at the time decided was too controversial to appear in the public domain. But that was the national accounts, and those were national accounts drawn up largely on the basis of household income, because households were very much the beginning, as it were, to how you measured national income. And we've moved increasingly towards a sort of production-orientated version, and this took, I think it reached its limit in the SNA 1993, when the production side really dominated. And if you look at the order in which things are discussed in the National Income Blue Book, it used to be that the personal sector came first. After you got to the aggregate figures, you then got tables for the personal sector. Now it appears next but last in the list after other sectors. So I think it's almost as well a sign that the priorities have changed. And also, it is now very difficult to disentangle. The purpose of this diagram is not meant to, particularly at the back of the room, to allow you to see, although I will be spelling out a few of these points in a moment. If it conveys an impression of something which is very hard to read, that's exactly the impression it's meant to convey, because it is very hard to read the current national accounts if you ask the question, what exactly is the implication for the level of individual household resources? And of course, I'm focusing here, and this is what we were asked to do in the session, on material well-being. I'm not discussing wider issues about how we should measure well-being beyond economic resources. And that's a shame, because there's an interesting story to tell, and this is a story which I hope will get more attention very soon when the report that Stephen Jenkins, who's in the audience, is about to produce on the distributional effects of the recession. But I think there's an interesting story before one looks at the distributional effects. This shows the Eurozone, and it shows the GDP figures, which are all indexed from 1999, and these are all volume figures. It shows that GDP grew in the Eurozone over the course of the last decade up to 2007 by something on the order of 20%, and then fell precipitously after that. So those are the squares on the diagram, and then the line which is joining it is what happened to the real household gross disposable income, which is not so easy to discern from the Eurostat. You have to look for it, if you can find it, but it's not the headline figure. And that's what I think we ought to be looking at, because in a sense it's closer, but not quite as close as I'd like to be, as I'll explain in just a moment, to what we actually want to look at. And it tells a story which I think is an interesting story, and it's really not a story which has had much publicity. It's a story which shows that from about 2004, say, the line, rather than the squares, grew rather more slowly over this period. So there was a period of 4 or 5 years when household incomes were not rising at the same rate as GDP. And I think it's worth stressing this, because it was a period when essentially people were asking where was the growth going. It was also a period which clearly meant where we were not sort of living beyond our means, at least in the Eurozone, not us in that case. And then you can see that after that, you then see, and I haven't brought the figures right up to date, I'm afraid, this, but you can see that for much of the period up to 2010, there was more or less a flatlining of household disposable income, not a precipitate decline. And that does show that the measures taken, the policy changes that were made, but also the automatic stabilizers, the much denigrated European welfare state, was actually doing what it was supposed to be doing over this period. And that's something which we have lost sight of, I think, that these programs were actually intended to protect people to some extent against falls in income, and they did do that. Not fully, but you can see it sort of tails off a bit, but it's nothing like as bad. And if that story had been told, but we might, I think, have a different view of quite what's going on in this period. And it's a story which is in the figures, but it's rather hard to get out. And this is a diagram I would like to see as it were coming out on the front pages of the newspaper, rather than just the squares, which is all you get in the headlines. Now, it is, of course, as I said, a particular measure, and one I'm not totally happy with, because if someone stops you in the street and says, well, actually, that doesn't correspond to what I've experienced in the last few years, then I have to say that they're probably right, because we have then to look a bit behind this, to look into the entrails. And I've done it here for the UK. This is rather than the Eurozone. This is just taking one country. It's doing it, again, in volume terms, in this case, based on 2001. And it's doing it per capita. And you can see there the hollow squares are the GDP rise to by nearly 15% over this time, and then the drop following 2007, and that's, I've taken only up to 2010, but you know the story since then. And then you've got the diamond shapes at the top, the sort of blue diamonds, which suggests that the UK didn't lag behind very much in terms of gross household disposable income behind GDP in the early period. So it appears that what I showed you before was more a Eurozone phenomenon rather than a UK phenomenon. We didn't sort of save up a bit over that period. And you can then see what happened since then is that household disposable incomes, again, as measured by national accounts, are more or less stable after 2007. So that, in that sense, the UK was having the same experience as the Eurozone. But of course, it doesn't necessarily match up to what people say when you talk to them on the bus or whatever, because they say, well, hang on, it isn't quite what's happened to me. And it isn't quite what's happened to me because they actually have in mind probably something else than what's measured in this household disposable income figure. And that's the purpose of this graph, which is just to step back and say, what if you think about what you mean, the man in the street, person in the street, in terms of spendable income, to get to that, you have to disentangle, and you have to disentangle particularly a number of important imputations. And again, this is part of the story of national accounts. They've increasingly, because they want to improve, have moved to having much more in the way of imputations. And so you have, for example, to take off the imputation of the net equity of pension funds, that is the addition essentially, which is making households better off in a sense, but they certainly don't usually typically say, oh yes, thanks for that. It's good of you to put it into my pension fund. They probably are aware of, but didn't think of as income, the imputed value of government services, which of course has been a major part of the story over this period. Quite a lot of the GDP has gone into improving the health service and education and other things. And that's what's measured in the individual consumption of public services, which is the biggest adjustment effectively here, which takes you down to the line whose colour I'm not sure is a sort of yellowish kind of colour with triangles. And then finally, there's imputed rent and owner occupation, which of course is in there for understandable reasons, but understandable to national accountants and economists, but less so to the person in the street who may not quite see that you can see increased contribution in the recent years of imputed rent may not correspond to what they think they've been getting. And that's why the spendable income series that I end up with, one at the bottom, the squares, shows a much smaller growth over the decade as a whole, around about 6-7% rather than 14-15%. And that's one of the gaps which I think creates some of this misunderstanding about the relationship between growth and how people benefit. The other source of misunderstanding, and this I'll deal with much more briefly since I think the points are very well understood, is who gets this. As my teacher in Cambridge used to say, qui bono, is Joan Robinson used to say, that's the question. Who gains from all this? And that's not just about the UK, it's about individual citizens. So the second question is the Stiglitz recommendation about bringing distribution in. And the only really major point I want to make here is a very simple one, but I think it's very important, is that distribution, if you're assessing the performance of an economy, not just doing accounting, which is a very perfectly reasonable exercise to do, but if you're trying to use this as an evaluative instrument, then the distribution has to be an integral part of it. It's not a sort of add-on. It isn't an optional part. It's not like you can say, here's GDP or national income or household income, and over there, by the way, down there somewhere is the Gini coefficient that tells you what's happened to distribution. These things have to be looked at together if you're evaluating, and not if you're simply looking at the flows of resources, but if you're thinking about evaluation, it isn't a thing to do, here's a separate branch which does it. This has to be something which is integral. And that's why I've certainly urged on the Stiglitz Commission, and they've certainly put it in, that we should look at measures which integrate them, such as the three I've listed here. One is simply using the median rather than the mean, which is another central measure of central tendency, but one which is much, in some sense, more meaningful and easily interpreted by politicians who understand about people in the middle, and so on. It would probably appease Ed Miliband to some degree if we looked at median incomes rather than mean incomes. Or, as one of the co-organisers of the Commission proposed many, many years ago, to measure 10 real national income, that is simply apply distributional weights, and the way of doing that is simply to essentially, if you follow what he suggested, is adjust the mean by 1 minus the Gini coefficient as a measure of the inequality. And I should just point out this is a measure which is fully consistent with responding positively to anyone's income going up. Sometimes it's asserted that if you bring in things like this, you're saying, attaching a negative weight to an increase in the income of rich people at the top. This doesn't, it may give very little weight, but it nonetheless, it gives some weight to everyone. Everyone gets a positive weight in that. Or following recent events, we could look at the bottom 99% and forget about the top 1% altogether. And this is straightforward to do. I mean, it's a matter of getting out your calculator and doing it. So it isn't so easy to do up to date because you need distributional information which comes with a longer lag. So you can't be looking at last quarters or something, but you could do much better than we do now in terms of being up to date. But it's very straightforward to do, and it does change the picture. And the last slide, effectively after one slide, shows what would happen in the UK if over the last 50 years we had used these distributional measures, and rather than growing household income at 1.94% on the SEN adjusted measure, it would be something like 1.55. So it would be, we'd have lost something like 0.4% per annum in growth because of the changes, adverse changes in the distribution of income. And I assume 0.4%, if your commission can produce an extra 0.4% on the growth rate, you'd be rather pleased. So, I mean, 0.4 is serious. It's a serious adjustment. But as I said, it's straightforward to do, and it would be very easy, for next week, someone simply starts producing distributionally adjusted GDP figures and discussing those with the same intensity we discuss the GDP figures. And so I'll leave out the top the bottom 99. We can come back to that in the discussion. But just to summarize what I've been saying, there's clearly a lot was contained in the Stiglitz Commission, which suggested very wide-ranging changes. There was also a lot which suggested which could be done very easily. And I think we shouldn't forget about the things that could be done rather easily, just to change the way we think about things immediately, as well as thinking about the other much more ambitious ideas about measuring well-being in more general ways and so on. We can immediately, for example, look at household income in a more meaningful way, get that quarter by quarter, and we can immediately make inequality adjustments if we chose to do so. And I hope that's something your commission might encourage people to do.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll go to Paul next.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I will do two things. I will give you a very, very brief background on what the OECD does in the area of measuring well-being, and then more specifically focus on two measures that we are proposing by way of measuring material well-being. And you will very quickly notice that they are pretty much on the same page as the measures that Tony has put forward. So just by way of a background, the OECD in its work on measuring well-being follows very much the basic structure that came out of the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report. Basically, we're looking at measures of material well-being, which are very much centered around national accounts type measures. We're then looking at measures that describe the quality of life in the form of a number of dimensions. They are listed here. I won't be going in those. One of these dimensions is subjective well-being, but that's only one of them. All the others are what you would call objective measures. And finally, there's an item on sustainability where we're trying to look at well-being over time. The basic approach that we have is characterized by four items. It is multidimensional, so we do not believe in a single indicator of well-being. We try and focus on households and individuals in our measures. We try to focus on outcomes rather than outputs or inputs. For example, health would be described by the status of health of the population rather than by the expenditure on health services. And the distribution of these characteristics across households or individuals for all dimensions is something that we try to pursue in our work. If you want to know more about our general work on well-being, I refer you to a recent publication that we brought out. It's called How's Life, and it covers those dimensions and the data we have for the OECD countries. Now, let me talk more specifically about the first group of indicators, that is measures of material well-being. Before doing this, I would like to make a statement about GDP, because sometimes I think there's a bit of a confusion or a danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to say. We do think that GDP is and has been and remains a useful figure for a certain number of purposes. Namely, for the purposes that it was conceived as a measure of output, production, for monitoring macroeconomic policies. It is important if you want to measure productivity. In short, if you want to have information basically on economic activity on the supply side of the economy, you still need GDP. So it's not an issue of doing away with GDP. It is an issue of using it for the purposes for which it has been conceived. One purpose for which GDP has not been conceived is measuring well-being. And this is where you need additional measures. But the implication is not that GDP needs to be supplanted. The implication is that GDP needs to be supplemented by a small number of meaningful additional indicators. At the European level, there has been a discussion on this, actually, which started out with the title GDP and Beyond, and it started out with the title Beyond GDP and became GDP and Beyond. So you noticed a small but important difference, and I think we would very much sign up to this. So what are the measures that we would envision to supplement a GDP so as to get a better grip on material well-being? I think there are two levels at which it is interesting to look at these. The level of the total economy, so if we want to make statements of the average well-being of a country as a whole, and secondly, the level of households, which is very much in line with what Tony just presented. Let's have a look at conceivable measures of well-being, material well-being at the total economy. And I will take you a little bit into the national accounts terminology, so please bear with me. It's actually not that complicated. The first and general issue is that if we want to measure material well-being, we are well advised to look at measures of income rather than at measures of production. And now, in a very simple sense, these two are equal, but as soon as you add or take off certain elements, they can become quite different. The first additional subtraction that we would carry out is to move from a principle of domestic income to a principle of national income. What does that mean? It means you take account of income flows in and out of the country. This may not be all that important for some OECD countries. It is important certainly for countries outside the OECD area. When you think of remittances, for example, that are being paid or received by developing countries into developing countries. But it is even, there are some OECD countries where you get quite a stark difference, whether you look at a national or domestic income. Ireland being a case in point. You have a lot of foreign investment, income leaves the country afterwards, so there's a difference in the evolution of national and domestic income. Switzerland would be the other way around. There's a lot of Swiss investment abroad, so there is income repatriated, which raises Swiss national income as opposed to its domestic income. Second adjustment in terms of income is to look at a net rather than a gross measure. Essentially, that means accounting for the fact that our assets depreciate or are depleted as we undergo economic activity, and that any gross measure does not account for this. There's, of course, the depreciation of fixed assets. This is what we normally find when we look into our national accounts. So this would be the depreciation of machinery, equipment, structures, and so on. But I think we should also look at the depletion of natural assets in such as mineral and energy resources, soil, timber, water, aquatic resources. These are all economic assets. I'm not talking about ecosystem services, which would be even a step beyond this. But there are a number of resource-rich countries. Think of Australia, Canada, UK, Netherlands, where neglecting the depletion of the natural asset gives you a kind of a biased picture of the actual income, the net income that is available to the country at the end of the day. All these adjustments can be done or would be done in a first instance basically at current prices. But then there's a question of how do you move from a current price measure to a real measure, and the different options to do so. Now, theory would actually tell us that we should deflate these income measures with some kind of price index that reflects consumer prices, so as to express our income measures in equivalents of consumer goods and services. In one word, at the national level, the target measure to be put forward would be something could be called real net national income, adjusted for the depletion of natural resources. I should add that in principle, all these figures exist in the current national accounts. They're not well developed. Not all countries have full balance sheets where they would recognize, say, the natural assets, where they would be able to measure the depletion, but we don't have to make any conceptual leaps here to get these measures in place. We only have to get the data in. There's some work ongoing at the OECD in the context of green growth that targets precisely the development of better measures of the depletion of natural resources. I don't have to go into this here. The second measure that I'd like to mention is households, and we've already heard about this. Here, just to kind of set the picture, it is a non-trivial matter looking at when you compare real household incomes and volume GDP. And just as Tony showed the slide with the evolution of the EU household income and GDP over time, here's a cross-country comparison. It stops before the crisis, but the message is still the same. You can have very different evolutions, even over longer periods, of real household income and volume GDP. That's a different way of saying that volume GDP growth is not a good proxy for measuring household income changes. So what would be the measure for household income to be put forward? Well, first, we would say that it should be a measure of disposable income, which means it should capture the various transfers that households undergo between the household sector and other sectors. So, for example, you'd like to take account, of course, of taxes that are being paid by the households, of monetary transfers that the households receive, of the income that households pay or receive from abroad. So we should be looking at the end of the income accounts, so to say, not at the beginning of the income accounts. A second adjustment is moving from what is called disposable income to adjusted disposable income. That just means that we would like to capture the money equivalent of the services that government provides at low cost or for free. In particular, these are health, education, and housing. Because both over time and, of course, between countries, one can get quite a biased picture by ignoring the fact that different countries would provide different levels of government services over time. And again, we would like real measures rather than volume measures, that is deflating this whole income by some kind of consumption price index, probably a price index that reflects this actual final consumption that captures also the government services. And last but not least, add in some information about how this disposable income is distributed between households. This brings us back to Tony's presentation. I put median income here, but of course there are other options to do. They are all equally meaningful. So in one word, the target measure here would be real median adjusted disposable household income if you want to have the national accounts denomination. We do have a project actually ongoing that tries to address this issue of bringing distributional information to the national accounts. It would seem straightforward to say that, oh, we have all this information on household income distribution out there from surveys of households anyway, so why don't we just plug it into the national accounts? That is a little less easy than it sounds, because the definition of what constitutes income is actually different in the national accounts from these household surveys. So one has to reconciliate the definitions and the measurements to make these distributional elements precisely the integral part of the accounts that were mentioned before. We're doing this with a number of countries, and hopefully we'll have a set of results later this year. This is just a little example from a case study that was done in France 2 years ago, so where you see a household account broken down by income quintiles. So, moving from primary income, this would be wages, adding or taking off taxes, adding in benefits to disposable income, adding in the government transfers in kind. But all this is done for each of the income quintiles, and it gives you a very interesting picture of how redistribution works in an economy. It also gives you interesting information about saving rates, which are vastly different, of course, between the various quintiles of income. All right, to sum up my messages, I think this is about GDP and beyond, not necessarily about beyond GDP. Well-being, at least as we understand it, is multidimensional and requires measures of material well-being and quality of life. For material well-being, there are two types of information that we think are central and should be coming up more to the headline of statistical communication. That is, at the national level, measure of real net national income, depletion adjusted, and at the household level, a measure of real adjusted disposable household income, distribution adjusted. I end with kind of a remark that relates to something that was also put forward in the report by the Stiglitz Commission. It is worth periodically to assess the value of household services that are produced at home. This is not part of the national accounts, and I don't think it should be part of the national accounts, but it is useful to recognize that a lot of household services are produced without any monetary transactions. And these are probably becoming increasingly important. Think of the care of the elderly, childcare, washing. There's a big gender component, of course, in here. And it is a useful addition to the information that the national accounts provide to value these services at least every 3, 4, 5 years to get a sense of how they evolve and where they're going. And on this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now we have to make a technical leap to Jean-Paul. Can you hear us?
Okay.
We can hear you. Far away.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this hearing. I'm very happy to be here in the room.
Virtually.
To find myself associated with a very important member of a commission on economic performance and social progress. I will speak taking paper that Joe Stiglitz and myself have written. It is the Robert Journal paper, so there will be no slide, but some points which we think are important. First, we consider that there is not a single year since 2008 where our measurement system has not been called into question. The financial crisis revealed that we were not doing as well as we thought when we were looking at level measures. But this we realized that economic growth was not sustainable, and the output measure had been exaggerated by bubble prices in real estate and by the fictional profit in the financial sector. The fact that in some countries, say the US, GDP has returned to pre-crisis level does not capture in any way the diminution in the sense of well-being. For example, in the US, with almost 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a good job, unable to get one, and others facing the risk of losing their home. The loss in well-being is enormous. The situation in Spain is even worse, with an unemployment rate higher than 34%, and more than 1 out of 2 young Spanish unemployed. I'm trying to make 4 points. The first is that the event in Japan last year can be seen as a metaphor of our measurement problems. Some suggest, well, that while in the short run GDP may increase, in the long run it will rise as a result of the reconstruction efforts. The nuclear disaster has increased anxieties and may well have significant health effects on large number of population. Again, the expenditure required to respond may raise GDP perhaps at half to get Japan out of its long-standing malaise. But no one will claim that Japan is better off as a result. It would require a huge increase in GDP to compensate for the destruction of capital of all kinds of assets that the event has caused, and to offset the increased anxiety that so many in the country face today. And our metrics are not good at measuring the value of a lost asset. Even if it were, the arithmetic of compensation will not tell us much about the way the well-being of Japanese people has evolved. In the aftermath of the crisis, we now realize that our measures before the crisis were also not accurate. GDP may have been higher because of a greater efficiency in cost saving as a result of the reliance on nuclear as opposed to, say, renewable energy. The placement of a spent nuclear material in a way that exposed the entire country to risk that are now so evident may also have contributed to the seemingly higher GDP value. But just as accounting framework before the financial crisis misprices risk, so too in Japan. The Japanese case is thus a metaphor because it underlines the three shortcomings of our methods: the measurement of the economic product, the measurement of well-being, and the measurement of sustainability. And second, another universal fact well documented is the intra-country increase in inequality, which has characterized at least the past quarter of century. That the slide shown by Tony and Paul are interesting in this subject. The problem is the following. If, as it has been documented by a study of OECD, that 80% of the population has had an increase of income lower than the average rate of income growth, then the distribution of this increase has been the lower is the decimal considered. We think that we have a problem because what we want to know is what is happening to most citizens. And GDP tells us little thing about that. And the slides shown by Tony are very striking about this fact. Another example is provided by the bad use of GDP. I believe, like Paul Schreyer told, that we don't have to throw out GDP of our statistical method. We have to look at GDP and beyond. But when we look at GDP, and I am referring to what did happen in the Arabic world, when we look at GDP, we could be led to conclude in the way Robert Barrow did when he tried to make a relationship between the degree of political freedom and the increasing and the growth of GDP. And its conclusion was that the increase in the growth of GDP is the higher for a political regime which have a kind of 0.5 on the scale of political freedom. The scale going from 0 to 1. But even if the result of of a study by Robert Barrow is exact, and it is not, we know, the conclusion of the country would be most advised to postpone democratization until they can afford the luxury good but prostitute freedom is not a secret. It may well be that well-being increase more from an increase in political freedom than from an increase in GDP, especially the way GDP is measured. Third example is sustainability. We know that it is important for any society to form an assessment, no matter how imperfect, about whether its current consumption of well-being or well-being is sustainable, and whether cost is coming at the expense of future generations. We can ascertain whether society wealth is increasing or decreasing per capita if appropriately measured it is increasing. Then presumably society can do in the future whatever it did today. That is, it can sustain its per capita income. But we need a comprehensive measure of wealth, and we need to be sure that the valuations are correct. One of the problems encountered in the aftermath of the financial crisis is the misuse of the concept of sustainability. The lack of an indicator of sustainability may lead us to an unsustainable path, but the partial measure may lead us to wrong policy. The case in point is Europe. Sharing a common currency in the global crisis, Eurozone countries are currently looking for sustainable indicator in order to assess the financial sustainability, by which they essentially mean the sustainability of public debt of each member country. They are trying to define sustainability objectives to implement economic policies that are sustainability friendly and spread information to the financial market in order to reduce pressure on public and private sector borrowing. The problem is that European countries are focusing on a very partial view of sustainability, namely the sustainability of public debt, which leads them to impose on peripheral countries austerity program, that is, pro-cyclical policy, which would likely result in a much lower rate of growth and may eventually lead to financial sustainability and sustainability. One of the problems is that if policy aimed at reducing public debt lead to the destruction of social and human capital, but this destruction are not taken into account because we have no metric to measure that. We will be led to enforce policy which will reduce sustainability because of a loss of human and social capital, and having just gained 1 point of GDP of public capital by the mean of reduction of the public debt. Now, the fourth point I want to do is about the well-being and the business side. In its report, the Commission emphasized the importance of employment itself. One point where various subjective measures of people's well-being agree is that unemployment has a very adverse effect on people's quality of life. People who become unemployed report lower life evaluation even after controlling for their lower income. The adverse effect persists over time. The unemployed also report higher prevalence of various negative feelings such as stress and pain, and lower level of positive ones. One may also suspect that the adverse effects of unemployment are felt even by those who are not themselves unemployed, especially in society where there is high unemployment. It's not mass unemployment. And all of these suggest that economic fluctuation may have strong asymmetric effects on well-being, something we should already intuitively know. Moreover, some of the consequences on health and education may be irreversible. So that is the reason why we should develop other metrics to complement what the GDP figure is telling us. As I have tried to show what we measure affects what we do. And if we are not measuring the destruction of human capital, we would not have the complete picture of the consequence of the policy we are undertaking. Thank you for having me here.
Well, thank you very much for that contribution. Now, we've got about an hour before we have to break because there's a sort of hard deadline of noon. And I think we need to provide some time for people from the audience to put their questions, because there are clearly some people here who come with questions. So I'm going to suggest that the commissioners definitely don't take more than half an hour in grilling our guests, and ideally less than that. But I think the thing to do is to sort of pass the questioning rounds. Fortunately, there aren't very many of us here, so we can be reasonably economical, and we can have we need to have a broader discussion later with everybody on the Commission on the big question that this all raises, which is, what does this, what's the bearing of all this on our work for the Commission about growth? And I mean, how far, is any of this really relevant to the way you design policies as opposed to evaluate economic performance and assemble statistics in a way which tells you something about outcomes. But that's a bigger conversation that we'll have later, though. If anybody wants to add something on that, that would be helpful. I'm going to start off by suggesting, Tim, you lead off the question.
Well, actually, I was going to come in on precisely that point and get each of our presenters, perhaps, give us their preferred example of a policy implication that they think comes out of a richer view of material well-being, rather than a traditional focus on GDP. So where do you think, if at the end of the day this commission is about trying to produce some policies, and I wonder whether each of them had or could offer us an example of where they think the way they're encouraging us to think would lead to a different policy implications of the kind we might reach if we were too focused on GDP.
Okay. Not to give an answer in terms of sort of specific policies for growth, but rather one of the things I think came out of thinking about this is the need perhaps to reposition expectations with regard to growth, which I think is in fact part of policy. And I think that the kind of decomposition I was looking at of where the difference in GDP growth and household incomes was drawing attention to the fact that the uses we make of increased resources is going to be one of the big issues for decision and is going to be highly contested. And over the recent years, we've, certainly in the United Kingdom, allocated quite a lot of this to the expansion of individually consumed public services. And I suspect that's going to be continuing, partly because of the role probably played by education in terms of growth for other reasons we've probably discussed in other sessions. We're not going to reduce our investments in education, but certainly also in terms of the aging of the population and the healthcare needs and personal care needs. And so I think that it's rather important that somehow there should be a lowering of expectations without necessarily saying we're going to grow more slowly, although we may well think that may also be true, that nonetheless one can't expect that household cash spendable incomes are going to rise at the same rate as GDP. And I think bringing out that gap between the two will perhaps personally, first of all, have a effect of correctly lowering expectations, which will reduce pressures on governments and others in terms of their performance, and also, I think, allow a much more sort of sensible debate about what we should do. With, after all, as the figures show, we've had a big increase in the resources measured in this way in the last decade. I mean, everyone talks to the last decade that was sort of lost or something. We had probably somewhere between 15 and 20% increase over that decade in resources. And we have very little discussion about exactly where that was going to go. And I think that discussion is an important one to have ex ante rather than necessarily ex post.
I'll give you two examples where I think a different presentation of the indicators could play a role. I mentioned the depletion adjusted.
Could you speak loudly?
Yes, can you hear me now, Jean-Paul? The first example is the depletion adjusted income. This may be, well, it may be an issue for the UK, but there are certainly other countries where the economies are thriving on resource booms. I mentioned Australia now, where it is not clear what the accounting looks like if we don't take into account the fact that the Australian economy, GDP, runs on the fact that natural resources are being depleted. That may be, may be going on for a long time or not, depends on the resource, but it is a fact that GDP itself does not give us the right story there about what is the sustainable income for the Australian economy. And indeed, in Australia, a lot of people ask themselves, how will the economy continue? What happens if the growth in China slows down? So there are lots of questions, and I think it would make sense to bring this to the forefront with depletion-adjusted income. The other example is the household income ventilated by distribution or quintiles. As you could see from the little table that I showed for France, this tells you actually a lot about social policies and whether they work or not. You want to know, you want to make sure that the redistribution, if it's envisioned by the government, actually gets to the right people. And just looking at the wage rate of the economy, basically where the incomes get into the economy, is not enough, because you want to make sure that the distribution process actually works, and that you can only do by disaggregating your household accounts by income group.
Okay, Jean-Paul, do you want to come in on this question of policy design? We can't hear you. Switch.
You're mute.
You're mute. Please switch your machine on. Yeah. Yes, okay.
No, I wanted just to say that certainly Atkinson has done a lot of work on measuring the government production, and that would be of great value, because for the moment we are mismeasuring, I think, the production of knowledge, the production of education, because we are just valuating these through the expansion. And if we try to develop some metric or measuring government production, we would have a better picture of what is happening to GDP, even without changing our indicator. That's all.
Okay, are you happy with those questions?
I'll hand over to my colleagues, I'm sure.
Okay,
Sure.
shall I go next?
Pick up.
So thank you for very interesting presentations. I think that the thing to me, it's like confusion, I think, over some of the presentations, at least in my mind. So it seems to be at one level, people were saying, you know, what's the measure that we want everybody to focus on? We want the Financial Times to focus on this particular measure. And, you know, there isn't a magic number for the, you know, the average well-being or the median well-being or whatever, however you want to think of the well-being, I think, of the nation. And it's more of a kind of, there may be a kind of political or media strategy in terms of producing a better figure that people latch onto rather than GDP. I'd be very interested in, you know, whether you think we could certainly think about developing a better number, maybe the SEN number or some inequality-adjusted number which would stick in people's minds better. But, you know, I mean, there's some purpose to that. But it seems to me a lot of the things that we were discussing here were things that could already be done. I mean, I was very struck by what Paul said, that, in fact, most of the adjustments that we need to be done to the numbers are already effectively there. And it's actually the analysis and presentation of those numbers. I mean, I'm not undermining the OECD's important work to do that. And maybe we need to get more resources to do that. So I'd be very interested in terms of a kind of policy question. What, you know, if we want to produce a better number or convince people to use a better number, how do we actually do that as a practical way of doing that? I mean, I'd just like to take your views. I mean, my overall sense was, in fact, that, you know, for looking through your presentations, the GDP per capita is actually not it's a pretty good number to look at. I mean, I was actually struck when Tony presented his figure, taking into account, starting from the top line number of gross disposable income per capita, and then moving down, real GDP per capita, moving down to spendable income. We do want to, of course, have government services in there because they are really improving the well-being of people. We do want to take into account people's pension and equity. I mean, that's what we do want. I mean, I think going down to just household disposable income, you know, in some sense seems to be a mistake in terms of at least thinking about policy making. So anyway, that's mine. So I have a narrow question, what should we do? And a broader question, which in fact, listening to your answer, I came to the view that, you know, GDP per capita is not a bad way to think if you want to think about the total amount of the size of the economic pie that we then want to think about how we redistribute.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, you're right to say that there's confusion, and there's been essentially a confusion about this ever since the beginning of national accounts. In the sense there was always the tension between people who wanted to keep track of what resources were, and what you just described is exactly what people wanted in wartime, essentially, to know what resources there were available that were going to be used in military effort and how much was going to be available for domestic consumption. It's precisely that accounting exercise that originally led Keynes to ask James Mead and Richard Stone to produce the wartime national accounts. But of course, at the same time, these people were also working on welfare economics. And Samuelson and others say, well, actually, what you're doing, you can also attach a welfare interpretation to it. So there's always been this tension between an accounting, and Paul made exactly the same point, a tension between the accounting notion and an evaluative notion. And these two happen to coincide to some degree, but don't always. And that's why part of the confusion is people, as you rightly say, are using these for different purposes. And so that's why I think some of the measures which were being suggested were directed at the evaluation rather than the accounting part, and you may be more interested in the accounting part for certain purposes. Then I think that the point you make, which of course goes equally to the issue about the resources and how they're used, and that's indeed the purpose of this breakdown, was to bring out exactly, as it were, what different elements they go into, and that's why I said that the narrative that you tell is very important from the point of view of people's expectations with regard to what can be expected. I mean, the narrative about what has happened to spendable income is a different narrative from that from GDP. I mean, they end up at much the same point, but they had a very different course over this decade. One went up to nearly 15% and one hardly got above 7%. So the households feeling that they were not sharing in growth was a genuine one in terms of what they perceived of what they were getting. So I think that one has to tell this to have a narrative of this kind, because a lot of policy is driven by the apparent mismatch between what's happening and the expectations. And I think a lot of the story about why Europe went through its anxieties about growth and so on over the last pre-crisis was because of this mismatch between what people, in some sense, were being told was happening from the national accounts and what they perceived, and therefore explaining the difference between these is, I think, an important part of the political process. And this can be done, as you rightly say, and I think the first line of my conclusion was immediate changes can be made. Yes. We don't have to do a whole lot of new statistical work to do it.
Can I just abuse my privilege as moderator to just come in on that? Because when you were talking, and I looked at the various components when you were breaking them down, some of the things that are the difference between household income and GDP are very poorly measured. And in particular, government services, where, someone from the ONS here, but we changed the way in which we measure all that. God knows whether it is any better than the old way. But one reason why people may not have recognised the value of the increased spending on government services is that, actually it didn't reduce, the measurement of the outcomes was very poor. And similarly, the whole pension thing, imputed rent of owner-occupiers, these things are just very poorly measured. So aren't some of these crude problems part of the perception difficulty?
Yes, although I think one has to, I agree with you, but I think one has to say poorly measured is
an understatement.
Well, no, but it also it should be a relative statement.
Yeah.
And relatively, they're not necessarily quite so badly measured as all that, because much of the rest of GDP is badly measured too. And I think that when we had a manufacturing economy, it was relatively straightforward. I think the move to a service economy has made life so much more difficult, as Jean-Paul said earlier on. I think the whole how we measure the financial services industry is, I think, probably on any scale worse than how we measure government services.
Certainly in the same box, yes.
Certainly in the same box. So I think that you put your finger on what's clearly a serious difficulty. I think I should just say on government services, having written some...
Yes, well, I thought we might
a little bit about that. But I should say largely the work of the ONS, or I did all the work on the review we did. There are two basically methods. We are still in certain elements, and this applies here, using input measures, but for the GDP volume measures, we are using measures of output. And I think on the whole that, partly by putting more resources into this. When I first started the review, I think there were 3 people working on measuring government output. And I asked how many there were working on manufacturing, and I think the number was in 3 figures, 100 and something working
and
on
even
manufacturing.
more on agricultural, probably.
Yeah, probably. So that they have allocated more resources. So, and that actually is another point I would just stress also, which is, of course, that all of the things we're talking about involve resources. And it's at the moment, we're putting increasing demands on our statistical measurements at a time we're cutting back by 25% in ONS, if that's the right figure. And all around Europe, we're cutting statistical offices at a time we're putting more pressures on them for measuring targets and all sorts of things. So there's another mismatch, which is between the significance of economic statistics in the political debate, on the one hand, which is going up, and the resources for official statistical offices are going down.
So, John, perhaps you repeat your question, because I slightly hijacked that.
The narrow question is, I mean, what should we do? I mean, there is the resource allocation question in the statistical offices. Is that just what we should do, or in terms of, I mean, to promote other ways of better measuring, let's say, national well-being in terms of GDP and distribution? Because the study you put from IFS did that. I mean, we could do that. We could. It'd be the Growth Commission itself, the CEP, could put inequality-adjusted measures of GDP up and have that up on our website every quarter.
Okay.
Is that what we should? I mean,
I'll look for it tomorrow.
But I mean, yes. We could. But is that one of the things that we? I mean, it's a very practical question.
Yeah.
Would that be?
I mean, it is extraordinary. I said the figure for the eurozone. I mean, I only found it was in a technical paper produced by Eurostat that actually showed a graph like this produced for a conference. I don't think it's ever been published. So that is a question of the priorities, and that's a political judgment. That's obviously it would be perfectly possible for the ECFIN or some other body in the European Union to make sure that was prominently placed. Eurostat are producing the figures, but it's not getting the publicity.
Okay. Cool.
In terms of what should be done, even though many of the measures that we've been talking about are in principle in the current national accounts, that doesn't mean that all the tables are full or are full with the numbers at the level of quality that you'd like to have them. Okay, so it is clear that there are statistical construction sites that need to be followed up. They were already mentioned. I mean, measuring a volume of government output is something that there's still many gaps there, and there's a lot to be done in the area of health, education, and housing. We have big gaps in balance sheets. I mean, GDP is a flow measure, and you would never evaluate a private firm just looking at their profit and loss accounts. I mean, actually, before that, you would look at the balance sheets. Well, it's just the other way around with national accounts. I mean, everyone is focusing on the flow accounts, whereas really, at the end of the day, what matters for wealth is wealth accounts and the balance sheets, and how do you go from the opening to at the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and you have these movements in there, you have all the revaluations in there. You'd like to have these things broken down by sector also, and there are many gaps in the availability of data. The concepts are there, that's not the issue, but they need to be filled. And I mean, the initiative's ongoing, but they're not. It's not as if they were fully there. The same thing with the distribution adjusted income. I briefly mentioned that, yes, we do have a lot of information on how income is distributed among households or individuals. We do have information on how overall income evolves for the household sector, but we're still struggling a little bit with bringing these two sources together for some of the reasons that were mentioned, because there are different notions of what constitutes income. When you ask people, they have a different sense for what constitutes income than when you ask a national accountant. And bringing those things together is actually pretty tough job, statistically speaking, because at the end of the day, what you'd like to have is this integration that Tony mentioned, not just the distribution, not just as an afterthought, but really as part of the production process. And finally, it is communication also. I mean, what do we put up quarterly? Which are the numbers that we communicate on? And what are the things that we put out for debate? And I think there's still an asymmetry there in favor of GDP.
That would be a real challenge to put out quarterly income inequality adjusted GDP figures, wouldn't it?
Well, you certainly could put out a quarterly, I mean, already putting out average household,
you know. Exactly. The information content in quite a lot of the GDP figures that go out now is pretty low. I mean, it would be increasingly just the imaginary construct, wouldn't it?
A bit longer legs, but I mean, for example...
Well, you'll be doing an awful lot on the basis of stuff that actually hadn't been revised, you know, sort of hypothetical distributions or old distributions, I think, or projected distributions.
Although when new information comes in on the distribution, then you would revise it like you do the GDP numbers.
It would just be reducing even more the sort of hard news content to the GDP figures. But I think it's not the main point. Jean-Paul, do you want to comment on this issue?
Yeah, about the distribution issue. We need to have the distribution adjusted income, but we have to recognize that it would have different meaning in a society where there is strong social mobility, in a society where there is no such a thing. That means that the same measure could be a signal of something wrong and of something which is not that wrong if there is a strong social mobility. So, but anyway, it's not because we can interpret it in a different way depending on context, but we should dispense with having this kind of measure.
Francesco, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. Probably following up on John's question, I mean, I agree with John that it's probably a need to have a sense of what is the headline number that we want to focus on. I mean, it's great to say, well, GDP is good for this, household income is good for that, and national income is good for another thing. But in the end, you know, to think about performance and organized thinking is good to have a headline number and a headline statistic to focus on. Now, I couldn't be more sympathetic to the view that GDP misses things that are just too important to ignore. So I'd be very sympathetic to trying to find something else to focus on. And it seems to me that the discussion has given us two candidates, which is one is a national income figure, Paul highlighted, and another one is a household income-based figure. And I wanted to just try to focus now briefly on the comparison between these two, because I think both of them are better than GDP. But I'm a bit undecided between these two, so I wanted to get your help on that. So the household-based figure seems to me to have a huge advantage because they allow us to take into account distribution, which I think is incredibly important. So that seems to be like a very strong argument for going to the household level. Now, the disadvantage I think that's already come up a bit is measurement issues, particularly in terms of the lags that you have to have. I mean, if you want to have a performance measure, it would be good to have something that you can measure pretty quickly and not to have to wait for detailed microdata analysis. And so in that consideration of the data availability and the lags is counter the previous point about distribution and seems to favor national income measures. So I have two questions. One is it so to get a distribution you probably need to wait a bit, but do you think there are contemporary sort of leading indicators that can be used that have predictive power for distribution? So things that you can observe contemporaneously and that tells you something about what's happening to distribution and have a decent assessment of that. That might help reduce the concern with lags. But then, so that's one question. The other question is a conceptual one, which has to do with the role of the government. Because ultimately, well, you know, my national accounts are a bit rusty, but if I'm not completely mistaken, ultimately the distinction between household income and national income largely rests on what chunk of national income is taken by the government and what chunk is left to households. Now, if the government takes it and uses to say, provide health services or education services, then that difference is not that important because you can impute, in the household income, you can impute the value of the services received by households. And so then you can actually reconcile national income and household income that way. But say that the government takes a chunk of GDP and uses it to repay debt. Okay? Now that, you know, whether you want national income or household income, it seems to me to depend on whether you believe in Ricardian equivalence, essentially. Because if you believe in Ricardian equivalence, then repaying the debt means lower future taxes. You know, why wouldn't you want to count that as a benefit for households? On the other hand, if you don't believe in Ricardian equivalence, then you probably want to stick to the household income. I mean, I'm not asking you whether you believe in Ricardian equivalence or not. I'm asking you whether you think I'm thinking in the right way. I mean, I'm thinking about the right trade-offs here.
Well, Ricardo didn't believe in Ricardian equivalence, so asking me to is a bit too much. Yeah, I mean, I think, but that question, of course, brings out a point which, to some extent, Jean-Paul and Paul also brought out, which is, of course, the intertemporal nature of this. I mean, I think that complicates the things, and I don't think there's any straightforward answer to that. And we are taking a snapshot of which is a process in time, and I agree. I think that there are a few other elements to the story apart from the ones you mentioned. Of course, there are the retained earnings of the corporate sector, which vary quite a lot, so that's another part of it. And the role of institutions like pension funds and other things which become increasingly important. So they, again, this question, you can say, well, the fact that Legal and General or whatever got my money, I count it as mine, but actually that's another kind of equivalence I don't necessarily believe in. So I think that there are these other institutions which are complicated. The institutional structure is more complicated than it was in the old days, so to say. I think two other points. One is, I'm not saying we should move to a household basis and not look at national, particularly national income as corrected by the ways that Paul described. That's clearly a very important part of the story. I'm not saying we should, but I'm saying we need to look at both of these things, not one, it's not either or. And the difference between them is exactly what we're now talking about, is therefore an important part of what we should be discussing. So although I think it's useful to contrast them, I'm not saying this is you have to go for one or the other. Both are clearly very relevant, particularly in terms of your agenda, thinking about going forward, where the resources are going to go. And just if I could reiterate, I do think that the idea that we're going to have rising individual household consumption in the future at the same rate as GDP is simply unrealistic. And that gap is going to be taken up partly by the public services you mentioned, and of course partly by things which we haven't talked about much, which is environmental, essentially restoring the environmental damage we're doing, so the kinds of depreciations, etc. So there are several reasons why this gap, and that means, I think, among other things, that means that looking to the future, consumption per head measured in these terms, that is, in terms of individual consumption, is not going to rise so fast, which is one reason why we should therefore discount the future less than we otherwise would have done, because in the discount rate we apply following the Treasury instructions about public investment, of course, that depends on the growth rate, and that growth rate for that purpose is the growth rate of individual consumption. So that way we want to adjust that down. That means we have a longer time perspective, which comes again to the intertemporal. But then finally, the issue about timeliness is very important, and I know there's no doubt at all in the European Union that the adoption of Europe 2020 objectives, which include distributional objectives, has meant that for the first time, I think some people in the European Union at the senior level have realized that our statistics are rather out of date. So we can only assess the Lisbon agenda as we're now, more or less, even though it's finished a couple of years ago. And therefore, quite a lot of work is being done to speed up this. And some interesting work has been done about, for example, how you can produce first-round estimates based on surveys very quickly after the surveys are carried out. So Spain, for example, did calculations of their poverty rate that turned out to be accurate within 0.1% of the final value they arrived at several months later. So I think we are beginning, and of course this involves investment again, we can speed these things up. So certainly one was able to talk about, say, what happened today, to talk about what happened in 2011, may now be feasible.
So just to pin you down on this point, so how close are we to be able to measure, say, median household income with the same frequency as we currently measure per capita GDP?
We're not going to measure it at the same frequency as we do with GDP, because that's based on aggregate indicators of various sorts of and so on. So it's not, but we're certainly getting much closer to be able to do that. In the sense we can, probably say 6 months, 9 months afterwards, be able to use the household surveys to get something like a median, which is probably much less sensitive and therefore less affected by the kind of editing and so on done to the data. I suspect that could be done. So as a question of political will and resources as much as anything else. I'm less sanguine about whether we can think of other indicators that will actually be a good indicator or a leading indicator. I think that approach is interesting and attractive as a research question, but the idea of some good leading indicators of inequality, it'd be very good if we could discover them, but I don't know if that's going to be easy to do.
On the timeliness issue, I agree very much with what Tony said. Traditionally, it has been said that income distributions move very slowly, really, if you look at the OECD economies. Well, I'm not so sure that is still the case, but we don't quite know, and that's another reason why I think we need to develop tools that allow us a quicker judgment about, for example, what has happened over the last, two years or so with the income distributions. And of course, if there is more movement in terms of crises or over the business cycle, then that would give us also the tool to have a headline indicator that would be reasonably timely. I don't know about any leading indicators that could be used there, but then I'm not a specialist in this area. On the other question that you put forward on the role of government, I think you're right. We should, and that's actually part of the proposal, bring in the value of government services into household income. You shouldn't forget about the corporate sector when you think about redistribution within the economies. I mean, there's also flows between those.
That's a very similar question to the Ricardian equivalent question, right?
Yes, of course. If you project yourself in the long term, and at the end of the day, of course, households are owners of the businesses. Certainly in a closed economy, right?
Yeah.
There's another part of the sector that is the rest of the world, which significantly complicates things and does so even more if you think about this whole measurement in a context maybe slightly outside the OECD countries. I mean, John mentioned before that, well, maybe GDP isn't such a bad indicator to get a rough judgment on how well off people are. Yes, I think that may be true if you want to get a basic sense whether material well-being is higher in France than in Zimbabwe. Yes, your GDP per capita will give you all the basic story, but as soon as you dig a little further, you will run into the limits of GDP as a measure of material well-being. Think of and in particular for developing countries, think of a case where you have major foreign investments with repatriation of corporate benefits or profits afterwards. You can have a major difference between how your production measure evolves and how your income measure evolves for the population. So I don't think. So I still think that income is an important.
I agree with that, but that kind of data is currently available for, say, OECD countries, or is even my understanding was that getting those remittances and that type of data is available for OECD countries, or is that not the case?
Income and production data, that's available for OECD countries, yes.
So I'm getting a bit muddled. I mean, the spendable income that Tony was talking about excludes government services.
Yes.
Which are significantly redistributed. So aren't we missing something there?
Well, I guess it. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
I mean, if you think about the major changes in income distribution that are likely to come about in this country over the next few years, quite a lot of them will flow from changes in government services. That's part of it. We would miss that entirely, wouldn't we, by your measure?
Yes,
but we would pretend to know about it,
yep,
because we'd say this is an inequality-adjusted measure of income, but you would actually be leaving out of account one of the major engines for increasing inequality. Just to put it in a slightly more extreme version.
Well, look at the word major.
I'm just exactly. In terms of actually things changing over a short period of time.
No, indeed, this is talking about the inequality of the resources over which households have control.
Yeah, I think you miss quite a lot.
Well, you do, but then of course, I mean, you're
in a redistributive society.
But you're absolutely right. But then, of course, you have to ask the question: what do we know about the redistributive effect of these government services? And that's why, I mean, and that's a much more difficult question.
But there was something in one of your tables which suggested the bottom quintile gets the lion's share.
Oh, can you go back to the table?
I may have forgotten the number.
I think one has to be kept distinguished between the transfer part of the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think if you're talking education and health.
Yeah.
Can I get clarification on this question? What would conceptually stop you from constructing inequality-corrected measure of household income after imputing?
Oh, you certainly could do that. Yeah,
you can do that.
That's what, if I may just ask.
We can do that in the UK.
Yeah. Well, yes.
If you don't mind the quality of the data, I mean. Can't we?
Well,
we do publish something.
Stephen knows much more than I do, but probably.
We do publish.
Yeah.
No, but this is exactly
stirring my memories. But
yeah, we publish something called but that's an allocation, for example, which allocates health spending on a demographic basis, education spending equally per child. And so there's no attempt, for example. This is measuring. This is part of what Paul said. It's an input measure rather than an output measure. So actually, if you ask the question what the outputs are, which is what the National Accounts have been trying to measure, then of course we don't know who actually has the hip replacements and so on, and that would be by income group, and how good these hip replacements are. These are all
you say this. I'm conscious that I promised that I would give the folk on the floor a chance to ask questions, and we've eaten into that time. But you
very briefly on this. I think there are two slightly different perspectives to the same question. The perspective that Tony has adopted was one of a spendable household income in the sense what it is that people perceive typically as income. Okay, so kind of closing this gap between what is out there in official statistics and what the individual typically would identify with his or her material situation in life. Now, if you do that, you try to come as close as possible to a measure that tells you something about what is left at the end of the day to be spent on other things. Whereas the measure that, or the different perspective that we've been proposing is to actually say, well, if you want to get an idea of how well-off households are, you do want to take into account the services that households receive from government.
And that they value quite highly and should value more highly. I mean, the idea that we're going to produce an indicator which will encourage people to set a greater value on the tap that they buy in their local shopping mall as against what they get from the state in the form of free education and health. It runs against the grain, doesn't it?
But where we're not there in terms of the information base is to get a good sense of how these services in kind are allocated between different income groups. We know the total from the national accounts, but we don't know of exactly who benefits from where. This is part of the fringe study. So this is clearly a work where we need to do more.
Jean-Paul, do you mind if I open this? I mean, can you? Are you burning to say something, or can I open it to the floor?
Okay, let me tell you that it has been very hard for me to follow the discussion because of that.
Okay, all right. I'll give you a chance later on.
I was not intervening because I was never sure of having understood the question.
All right.
Some rumor and so on and so forth.
Okay, well, we'll. I think I would like to just give people who've come along a chance to ask questions. Yes. Do you want to say who you are?
Yes, Nick Olsen from the Centre for Economic. For Jean-Paul's sake,
I think
we
you
need the
need to have a
microphone,
mic.
otherwise Jean-Paul won't be able to hear you.
Yes, and an opportunity for him to. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to say, first of all, that I agreed very much with the way that Paul Schreyer put it, GDP and beyond, rather than beyond GDP. But I'd just like to raise a few issues around that topic. If we do go beyond GDP, we're looking at things like inequality, as everyone has said. But I'd like just to remind everyone of something that Tony Blair said a few years ago, which was that he didn't waste much sleep worrying about how to reduce Wayne Rooney's income. And I think he was very much in tune with the typical person's values in saying that, at least at the time, because of the notion of desert. The popular, it seems to me that most people are attached to the notion of desert, though philosophers, of course, have criticized this down the centuries. So that it all depends how you make your income, whether people find a high income objectionable or not. And so we'd all like to reduce the income of bankers and criminals and so forth, but not necessarily of people who've, gained their high income through what we regard as meritorious activities.
I wouldn't agree with you about Wayne Rooney.
Okay. All right. So that was one point. The other was that, again, if we move beyond GDP and thinking about some of the things that Paul Schreyer again listed the OECD is doing, I may have got it wrong, but I think that one thing was missing, which was what you might call income uncertainty. That people certainly seem to be worried about the prospect of losing their jobs. Obviously, they don't like actually losing their jobs, but they're just worried about the prospect of losing their jobs. They're worried about their pension not being worth what they thought it was, their house not being worth what they thought it was, and so on and so on. So an important aspect of economic well-being, it seems to me, is uncertainty. I'm not sure that... And there's also the prospect that uncertainty is increasing and has been increasing. And then finally, not to take up too long, an analytical issue which I think is very relevant for the Growth Commission. Does the growth process itself lead to outcomes that, on these other measures, which we might not like? For example, does growth lead to rising inequality? Does it lead to rising uncertainty, income uncertainty? Certainly on the inequality side, we have various theories out there which suggest precisely that: globalization, skill bias, technical progress. And in the past, we could have a division of labor. One lot of economists could promote growth, another lot of economists could discuss ways of alleviating inequality, and they didn't necessarily need to talk to each other very much because they were different problems. But it may be that these problems are now linked, and therefore that growth policies have to look at this rather explicitly.
Thanks. Now I'm going to take a few questions before we come back to our presenters. There's at least 2 or 3 hands up. It's Vicky Price next, I think. You had your hand up next, at the back there.
Hello, Vicky Price, previously joint head of the Government Economic Service. I found it all really interesting, but I just had a couple of questions really coming out of Tony Atkinson's presentation. And also a little bit from the OECD one. Do we make any assumptions about the right balance of the economy, or do we need to do so when we're looking at what the expectations of growth might be, or will they be subjective? In other words, if there is more investment in manufacturing, which of course has higher productivity and higher exports and all that sort of stuff, and higher spillovers, and we see that share either increasing or declining, is there an assumption in whatever you've said that we have to either lower or increase expectations of what growth may be in the future, because obviously it has different repercussions on the economy, or is it just a value judgment and therefore becomes incredibly difficult to do? And similarly, on the skill side, the depletion of capability, if you like, given that a lot of the growth in the economy in terms of translating into jobs recently has been in part-time, lower skilled, less training type jobs, because that's basically what they are, would we, under your principle, adjust expectations lower as well? Because we're just basically moving into a sort of depletion of that type of capability that we have in the economy. Because basically what we do know is that people who work in part-time jobs tend to be working at least one level below their skill level. So all these things are, of course, quite complicated, but you end up with a bit of a value judgment. I'm worried if that's the only thing we can do about these issues.
Thank you. Somebody there. and then you.
Stephen Jenkins, LSE. I'd like to make a remark about timeliness, which the panel picked up quite a lot, and the issue of nowcasting. And we put quite a lot of resources into macroeconomic forecasting and drawing upon those to nowcast. I'd like to suggest that the panel consider microsimulation as a way of doing nowcasting in a more systematic way. And so this picks up on Tony's point about resources being put into particular fields. So surveys are available. There are European-wide microsimulation models, for example, Euromod at the University of Essex, covering most of the EU25 now, and of course you know about the IFS model for Britain in particular. So I think Tony referred kindly to our project about the effect of the Great Recession on household incomes, and for our among our 6 case study countries, for 3 of them, we used microsimulation relatively successfully, I think, to draw implications about what had been happening now, rather than relying on historical data. Thank you.
There's somebody at the front here. I think there's 2 people here. This guy next to the original producer.
I'm Charles Seaford from the New Economics Foundation. 2 questions. One actually sort of closely related to that one. I mean, there was some discussion of lags in terms of distributional data, and I wasn't quite clear from the discussion whether the panel thought that those lag problems could be dealt with to the point where you could actually publish an inequality-adjusted headline figure that would actually displace the existing GDP figure as the sort of the news. And perhaps we need to rely upon the kind of techniques just referred to do that. My second question was related to resource depletion that Paul Schreyer was talking about and reaching a net number. And you mentioned that you had excluded ecological services. More generally, I wondered or whether you felt it was appropriate to consider not all externalities, but perhaps the most important externalities. For example, the impact of different forms of activity on climate change, and then produce some kind of discounted negative number to take that into account, or kind of make that a kind of adjustment, or whether you thought that was feasible.
And then there was somebody there.
Yes, Robert Wade at LSE. We have been talking like Platonic guardians and assuming that governments operate like Platonic guardians. I'm wondering, this is a lateral question, whether you have any thoughts about how, as resources for these statistical purposes are cut, how the statistical services can be insulated from government attempts to manipulate these numbers. Presumably, the Greek government made quite sure that the head of the Greek statistical service in the run-up to 2010 was a politically very compliant person who could do the massaging that the senior Greek politicians wanted. But Greece is certainly not the only case of this kind. I happen to know examples of China, where the Chinese government has done quite outrageous manipulation of its GDP per capita numbers, including by leaning on the World Bank to adjust its numbers for China's GDP. So there's a lot of interest involved on the part of politicians to massage the numbers one way or another. The question is how to curb this.
Question we've been grappling with in this country for a couple of decades.
Yes.
I think we'll just take one more. Yes. And then we'll go back to the panel for a final walk around the rich array of topics, which I'm sure you will again.
Thank you. I'm Glenn Everett from the ONS. I'm currently the Program Director for Measuring Wellbeing, and I should say ex-head of the National Accounts. And I'm also from the independent ONS. I'm very pleased the panel sort of highlighted that there's not one measure. It's very difficult. We need the objective and the subjective measures to actually look at the wider measures of well-being. I'm also pleased we're looking to supplement, not supplant. It's quite important. We don't lose focus on what's could be a variety of uses of some of this information. We have, just for information, we've actually produced the last couple of weeks a new household article looking at the income and expenditure of households adjusted for some of the government services in kind. And we're going to be putting that out on a regular quarterly basis from now on, which actually addresses some of the additional information we're trying to make available on some of these areas. I admit it is a long-term program and we're trying to take this forward. One of the questions I actually should get to is about education. Journalists and others very much concentrate on a single number, GDP, and very much concentrate on the latest quarter, particularly on the first release, which has a range of confidence, let's say, around it. Do we need to educate users, particularly if we're going to concentrate a lot more on distribution rather than a single number? I suggest today we've got a fairly biased audience who understands the differences and everything else, but if we're trying to push this out to the public in general, how does the Commission and others suggest we educate? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't think there's anybody else dying to ask a question. We've got 10 minutes before we have to release you for your trains. Shall we go in the reverse order? Start with Jean-Paul, who didn't have his opportunity. Have you caught all those questions?
Okay.
I don't think you probably haven't got time to answer every one.
One or two questions.
Yeah.
If I understood. There was a question about domestic or national income, and we thought that it was bizarre that when globalization increased, we skipped to a GDP figure rather than to a national account figure. And because the domestic figure we are not taking into account in the national channel of capital and of services. The second, and it's why the national figure seems to be much more adapted to the time we are living in. The second is about government and manipulation. We are not advocating creative accounting, of course. But one of the things which may lead the people to believe that public data are manipulated is the fact that they do not recognize the public data which are public. And they may not recognize themselves, not because governments are cheating or public agencies are cheating, but just because the figures we are giving to them are average. And nobody is recognizing itself nowadays in an average. So it's why there is a deep feeling about the gross figure and the inflation figures, but public statistics is lying because they are average figures. So it's why it is better to give a dashboard of indicator to the population to avoid this misunderstanding and this idea that governments are manipulating for electorate reasons and statistics. That's the question I understood, the other I did not.
Okay. That's probably a good excuse. Paul.
Nick mentioned the issue of economic insecurity. I think that's a very important issue. It probably actually gives rise to a more general dimension of insecurity or vulnerability, of which economic insecurity is one aspect. This is actually one of the dimensions in our quality of life indicators. So we're trying to capturing it there. I think it would be very hard to have this kind of volatility or insecurity element is an integral part of the more national accounts related measures. I mean, I wouldn't quite know how to go about it, but it is a very important point. I don't think we're making a value judgment by measuring these things. I don't think we're saying anything about what the right balance is between the different assets or between the different income flows. I think this is where the analysis has to come in, and the usage of this data has to come in, really. But I don't think that the construction of the data implies some kind of hypothesis that would already make a value judgment along those lines. My third answer, yes, there was a question about why the ecosystem services were excluded or why we shouldn't bring them in. I think this is for purely pragmatic reasons. To do an assessment or valuation of ecosystem services properly, you would need to have some kind of social valuation. I mean, what is the value to society of a healthy forest as opposed to the value of society from pulling timber out of that forest? And I think that at this moment, official statisticians are probably not yet in a position to embark on social valuations. I think this is a very important area, but I consider that an area for research rather than for the official statistics, simply because if you look at the existing data, the variation of the numbers that you get is very large because it implies a lot of modeling, and that would kind of, there's a trade-off between the credibility of the official numbers and the usefulness of bringing in these components. But in principle, I think it is an important issue. I don't have any great advice on how to educate the journalists, except for putting out the numbers and discussing them with the journalists.
How credible do you think national accounts based on micro-simulation of income distribution would be?
I'm not an expert on the micro-simulation, but I'm sure that if there is serious research being undertaken that allows just to nowcast some of the distributional issues and thereby enables us to have another headline figure that is of a similar timeliness as the one we're used to, I think that is something that would be quite defendable.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Last word for you.
Well, model-based estimates are not unknown in statistics, and
certainly are.
I think anyone who doubts that using microsimulation, I very much agree with what Stephen said, should look at how we calculate financial services indirectly measured from the point of view of examination. I think that would be an antidote to that. I just want to make 2 points, because there are lots of very interesting points made. One is what really is a subject for a whole session, I suspect, or more of this commission, the points that Nick first raised and then Vicky Price raised about the relationship between inequality and growth. And I think we could all talk for quite a long time. I think I just want to make 2 points. One is that obviously the sources of inequality are very much to be found in the structure of the economy as well as in public policy. It's very important, therefore, to look at that, and that's part of the story. So I believe it's all public policy. Secondly, in looking at this relationship, I think the comparisons across countries are often illuminating. And I think one thing which is very striking, if you go back in time, is that the earnings dispersion in the United States, reflecting the pressures of trade and technology and so on, went up by twice the amount it went up in this country. But the earnings distribution widened much more in the United States relative to the UK less. Income inequality measured at a household level went up by twice as much in this country compared to the United States. So the income inequality movements were much bigger here than they were there. So that suggests that. So the Gini coefficient essentially went up by 10 percentage points, where the American one's gone up by 5 or 6 or something. So that suggests, as it were, that the country differences, either in the structure of the economies or in public policy, are going to affect that. And then I think equally behind that is also another point which Vicky mentioned about part-time work, which I think is very important. It also relates to this somewhat uneasy relationship between individuals' situations and those of families and households. And that's one reason why the difference between the US and the UK came about, because the difference in individuals' And that's why it's not just part-time work, it's the distribution of part-time work and where it's located, in which households have it, and so on. So that's, again, another part of the story which tends to get missed. So we could look at individuals, we could look at households, and which you get then brings up a lot of interesting issues, including, amongst other, gender issues, which we haven't talked about. And then finally, on the politics of it, I mean, I think my own view is that I think that the steps made towards ONS independence have definitely been an improvement, but they are steps, and I think independence is not ever going to be attained. It's a kind of continuum where the degree of political involvement, maybe more or less, there's always going to be political involvement because of the resources. You can have an independent institution, but if you don't give it enough resources, then there's nothing they can do. So I think that it's degrees, and I think the UK is probably better placed. I've just finished a term on the European Statistics Governance Board, and we quite often wrote letters to countries about. You'll be surprised how often the heads of statistical offices change in different countries, and those are often. We've now inserted in the code of practice condition not only about the appointment, but also the disappointment, the sacking of the statistical officers. And then on the Wayne Rooney point, that's one reason I did stress that Wayne Rooney gets a positive weight in the inequality adjusted income, even though we're very small. He gets a weight according to his rank in the distribution, so he may be one or two, but he's got a strictly positive weight, so it's not falling foul of the Blair criticism. And finally, just to remind us that this whole enterprise of national accounts began with a man who wrote a book called Political Arithmetic, I'm afraid. It is political arithmetic.
Indeed. Look, thank you very much indeed for coming and giving us your time this morning. It's been really useful. Perhaps we give them a round of applause. Finished on time. Okay.